as the White House faces 2 wars abroad and mounting political challenges here at home. Plus, a dramatic day in court as Hunter Biden's daughter takes the stand for the defense, her emotional testimony driving her father to tears. As the question now looms, will Hunter testify himself? And U.S. job growth comes in hot in May, with hiring and wages both exceeding expectations, as President Biden struggles to make up political ground on the issue of the economy. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez in Washington, as President Biden is once again on the world stage, urging Americans and U.S. allies to renew the fight for democracy. While back at home, he's trying to brand his opponent as a threat to democracy, even as his presidency fights political headwinds and troublesome poll numbers. Today, the president spoke from Pointe du Hoc in Normandy, atop the steep cliffs that Allied forces scaled to stop Nazi machine guns from firing at Allied soldiers as they stormed the beaches on D-Day. The president invoked the bravery and the sacrifice of those men 80 years ago, as he called on Americans to take up the cause of protecting democracy today.
As we gather here today, it's not just to honor those who showed such remarkable bravery on that day, June 6, 1944. It's to listen to the echoes of their voices, to hear them, because they are summoning us, and they're summoning us now. They ask us, what will we do? They're not asking us to scale these cliffs, but they're asking us to stay true to what America stands for. They're asking us to do our job, to protect freedom in our time, to defend democracy, to stand up aggression abroad and at home, to be part of something bigger than ourselves.
Like his remarks at the American cemetery in Normandy yesterday, the president also drew direct parallels to the threat from Russia and Vladimir Putin, as he urges support from allies more than 2 years into the war in Ukraine. Defending democracy against extremism is a message the president often invokes at home as part of his re-election campaign. But that message, rallying behind the cause of democracy, does not appear to be boosting the president's standing with voters. New polling shows President Biden trailing former President Trump in key battlegrounds and tied in Virginia, a state Biden won by more than 10 points in 2020. As an issue, threats to democracy are not voters' top concern, and the president has struggled to connect with voters on what is their top issue, the economy, despite a stretch of positive economic indicators, including today, as the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported surprisingly strong job growth for the month of May. But just last month, nearly half of Americans rated the country's economic conditions as poor, with just 22% calling it excellent or good. And joining me now from Paris is NBC senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell. Vaughn Hilliard is in Scottsdale, Arizona with the latest from Trump world. And here with me on set is Jen Psaki, former White House press secretary and host of Inside with Jen Psaki on MSNBC. Thank you all so much for joining me. Kelly, I want to start with you in Paris. The choice of location for today's speech seemed to be inviting the Reagan comparison. So are the White House and the Biden team happy with what we heard from the president today?
They are, and of course it was history itself and the battle and the events of that day that necessitated highlighting the beaches of Normandy, and this particular cliff really described not only bravery but skill that American Army Rangers displayed 80 years ago. And so having that Reagan comparison, he of course did the well-known speech 40 years ago, it certainly invites in the political space those who might be admirers of Ronald Reagan, who might be independent voters, who might be Republicans who are not inclined to be in step with Donald Trump in this election. And so making those comparisons might open some doorways there. But the underpinnings of the history itself, the message about democracy being a call to each generation to do a job, maybe not a job that required the kind of life and death drama of D-Day 80 years ago, but that there are other things in which Americans are asked to uphold values, to vote in the way that they believe would support the American ideals and to take positions in everyday life that support freedom and support those kinds of ideas. To be willing to step up is basically the message of the president today. So it had the location, it had history, it had political rhetorical history, and it had a chance for Joe Biden to talk about things that were not directly invoking Donald Trump, but that was certainly evident for those who were listening for it.
Yeah, Kelly, you mentioned, Donald Trump and perhaps reaching out to independent voters in this speech without actually mentioning his name. As you well pointed out, this wasn't a campaign speech, but how does the speech mesh with the ongoing theme of democracy under threat? We've heard from President Biden in both his capacity as president and candidate. How effective do you think that message will be when it comes to voters over the next coming months?
Well, it will be a test for Joe Biden, who has been talking about democracy and doing it in a lot of different venues. This may be a venue invoking all of the emotion and the reverence for D-Day that takes people out of the contemporary political space and has them think about these issues in a bigger, more enduring way. Maybe that is a door that opens it up. When you look at the debates that are going on, you have certainly lawmakers in Congress who are supporters of Donald Trump who have not backed the war in Ukraine and the U.S. support there. There is conflict over the war in Israel and Gaza. There are concerns about the border and Republicans in Congress who did not support the bipartisan legislation, so the president went with an executive order earlier this week. So there are all kinds of implications in terms of policy, in terms of national security, that are current discussions of democracy, and this might be a way for the president to reach into that using D-Day as a means.
Kelly O'Donnell, live for us in Paris with a beautiful backdrop. Kelly, thank you. And I want to turn now to Vaughn Hilliard. He's in Arizona. And Vaughn, while President Biden has been in Normandy, his opponent has been on the campaign trail. So what did we hear from Trump yesterday?
We heard a lot about immigration here. This was his first return to the state of Arizona since October 2022, right before those midterm elections, when you saw candidates like Kari Lake, close allies of his, lose up and down statewide races. And in that 2022 midterms, you saw the democracy question and the election deniers who were the Trump-aligned candidates running, the voters repeatedly bringing up the threat of having the lack of certification of actual election results come into play at the state level. You also heard about abortion. Those issues, largely not just here in Arizona, but in key battleground states around the country, propelled Democrats in the midterms. And yet you saw in the poll that you suggested that immigration remains a forefront of the concern of the general election electorate. And you saw Donald Trump honing in on that and trying to play to that as an issue that he believes is politically relevant to him. Look, Donald Trump at the same time also likes to talk about democracy. He did that just yesterday, but Donald Trump misrepresents how the 2020 election went. He lies repeatedly that he actually won it, as he did just again yesterday. And he continues to paint false misrepresentations about the justice system here in the United States for the crowds that are ultimately going to be determining whether he gets put back into the White House, including about this trial, calling it a rigged trial against him. Of course, it was 12 jurors who were selected and ultimately one of the ones that unanimously determined to convict him. But for Donald Trump, so much of his political fate rests on the realities that he is painting for the electorate at large and putting that up against the one that Joe Biden is making a clear contrast about with his Republican rival.
And Vaughn, we were talking about this yesterday while you were at that rally. Former President Trump has really continued to flirt with that idea of revenge and political retribution after his conviction in the New York trial. Does Trump see that message as, having any sort of appeal beyond his base?
This is the part, I think, Gabe, where we get into the politics of how do you win. In a place like Arizona, he lost by 11,000 votes in 2020. And on one hand, Donald Trump and his campaign believe that they're going to be able to effectively convince a part of the independent or historically reticent conservatives toward him that he has been unfairly targeted and that these charges were brought against him for political purposes, that he was running for president of the United States. But there's also the part of the electorate that they hope they can turn from Trump supporters into Trump voters, those who didn't even vote into 2020, who they believe can be very angry and frustrated by what has taken place in the trial against him. I want to let you listen to Donald Trump last night in a conversation with Dr. Phil McGraw.
You don't have time to get even. You only have time to get right.
Well, revenge does take time, I will say that.
It does.
And sometimes revenge can be justified, Phil. I have to be honest. Sometimes it can.
But is the country better or worse for them going after you?
I think the country is really worse for what they've done. And I think you see that when you look at the poll numbers, when you see that almost $400 million has poured in since this horrible decision was made.
And you heard it there from Donald Trump, him believing the high fundraising numbers, the $140 million his campaign has brought in since the guilty verdict. He believes that that is justification for the way that he has portrayed his own conviction. And for Donald Trump, I think it's important to note, well, he has equivocated throughout the week on whether he would use retribution if he were to take back the White House. Over the last year, Donald Trump has repeatedly named individuals who he would seek to have indicted or arrested, everybody from Bill and Hillary Clinton to Judge Engoron, who also oversaw his civil fraud trial, to Letitia James, the New York Attorney General. Just yesterday, he called for the indictment of the members of Congress who were on the January 6th Select Committee. And so, while he can equivocate in some answers like that where with Dr. Phil, he has time and again repeated that he believes that there should be individuals, those perceived political enemies of his, targeted if he were to get back into the White House in 2025, Gabe.
Vaughn Hill, you're live for us in Arizona. Vaughn, thank you. I want to turn now to Jen Psaki, who's with me here on set. And Jen, you were just listening to that soundbite we played from former President Trump. He said, I believe revenge can take some time.
Yes.
What do you make of that?
You know, I think it goes right at the heart of what actually Joe Biden was trying to remind people of, which is that, you know, the reason why he can give a speech like that, one, Ronald Reagan, as you said, he was tapping into a lot of the themes of that. And the theme of Reagan's speech from 40 years ago and the theme of President Biden's speech from today were similar, right? Yeah. Which were about these Rangers, these brave allied forces who were thinking about something bigger than themselves.
And look, Kelly mentioned this as well, where President Biden would, of course, not give an overly political speech overseas. But think of how remarkable this is, Jen. The president, a Democratic president, is now relying on a former Republican president to get his message to try and attract more voters. Is that where we are in this campaign, that President Biden views himself as closer to Ronald Reagan than Donald Trump views himself closer to Reagan?
I think that's probably true. It is remarkable. What it also speaks to, regardless of who's relying on whom, is that the theme of Ronald Reagan's speech and the theme of President Biden's speech has been consistent. It's not in a partisan way about what U.S. American values are, about fighting, standing right beside our allies, about standing up for democracy. Those were the themes in the speeches. And so I think when you hear a comment, just to go back to your original question, like revenge takes time, that's like revenge is his revenge on other people. That is a campaign about himself. What the President Biden is trying to convey, and we'll see if it's successful, is I'm going to fight for you. Let's think about who we are as a country. These brave men who scaled who went to the beaches of Normandy, who scaled the wall, who were these allied forces, these Rangers. We are bigger than this. It's about fighting for something bigger than yourself, and he's fighting for himself.
Something that Vaughn alluded to that I want to ask you about. It seems that Donald Trump and his allies now are really trying to co-opt that message of threats to democracy. We've been hearing President Biden talk about threats to democracy for a long time. Talk about in 2020, his campaign is really hitting that hard this time around. But do you think the Republicans are essentially turning it on its head and making this conscious effort to describe, yeah, I think there's a threat to democracy, but it's you Democrats for prosecuting, Democrats and prosecuting Republicans and weaponizing the justice system, as they say. Are Republicans, does that cancel it out for voters? Does that neutralize the Democrats' argument?
It shouldn't, but it is. You've traveled around the world. You've covered a lot of things around the world. You know this is an authoritarian-esque tactic. It's a Putin-esque tactic, which is to throw back, project onto others what you yourself are doing, to muddy the waters. So it's a political tactic. Will it work? It didn't work in 2022, as Gabe alluded to. Well, it's not showing up in the polls now. Leading up to 2022, in the post-analysis of the 2022 midterms, democracy was front and center for people, and the Democrats did well because of their fight for democracy. But yes, this is an authoritarian tactic I think Trump is using and his allies are using to try to muddy the waters and make everything seem corrupt and everybody seem bad.
So whether or not that threats to democracy message actually works or not, something that a lot of people are focusing on is the economy. There was a good jobs report today. Do you think in the next coming months, we've been talking about the economy now for the last several months, how the Biden campaign really, hasn't capitalized on that. Some blame the media for not focusing on it enough. But what do you think the campaign needs to do in the coming months to really finally break through with that message?
Well, I think what I can tell you from doing a lot of presidential campaigns is you can't tell people how they feel about the economy, right? And nobody votes. And we all cover and talk about GDP numbers. They're important, as are these monthly job numbers. People don't vote on data. They vote on how they feel, right? And so for the Biden campaign, what I think is incumbent upon them and what they're discussing internally, I bet, is how to tap into kind of the emotions and the heartstrings of people, to remind them that he's the person who's going to fight for them, not Donald Trump. That's what it's ultimately about, not necessarily the data, because people vote on how they feel, not what kind of the GDP numbers are telling them.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. Tough part for a politician is to
very
make people,
tough, no question.
To make people feel something. So
yes.
It can be very hard. Jen Psaki, always a pleasure to have you
Great to be here.
Great to have your expertise. And coming up, a highly emotional day in court with Hunter Biden's own daughter, Naomi, addressing her father's drug use on the witness stand. Now, the question of whether Hunter himself could be called to testify. We're live outside the courthouse with the very latest next. Plus, new NBC reporting on an effort by Republican Party insiders to help progressive activist Cornel West in his campaign for president. That story's straight ahead. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Day 5 of Hunter Biden's criminal trial in Wilmington, Delaware has concluded, with the prosecution resting its case and Hunter Biden's eldest daughter taking the stand for the defense. It was an emotional day of testimony, according to our reporters in the room. Naomi Biden spoke quietly as she answered questions, saying she was nervous. Her father, Hunter Biden, could be seen wiping away tears as she spoke. Naomi testified extensively about her relationship with her father, saying he seemed, quote, hopeful when she saw him in October of 2018, around the same time he purchased a firearm and attested on a federal background check form that he was not using drugs. The trial is set to resume Monday morning, at which point the defense will have to decide whether to call Hunter himself as their final witness. And joining me now from outside that courthouse is NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli. And Mike, what stood out to you about the defense calling Hunter's own daughter to the stand, and how did the rest of the family react?
Well, Gabe, there have been some difficult moments, there have been some emotional moments, and yes, there have been some embarrassing moments for Hunter Biden and for his family throughout the week. But the word that really came to mind today as we took stock of this testimony from his eldest daughter, Naomi, was tragic. That she came to the courtroom, she went to the witness stand, clearly hoping to help her father's case. She testified in response to questions from the defense attorney, Abby Lowell, about seeing her father the summer of 2018, that she was proud of him, that he was as clean as he had been since the death of her uncle 3 years earlier. They talked about a trip to New York where they, in addition to introducing her father to her future husband, they were able to spend some time together, and she was able to testify about not seeing any drug paraphernalia in the car that was ultimately where the gun was discovered the next day, a key piece of evidence. But then under some very, very tough questioning from the prosecution, she was confronted with some text messages that it wasn't clear if the defense counsel knew was coming, about texts from her father late in the middle of the night where she wasn't sure where he was or why he was texting that late, about whether she was familiar with a man named Frankie, who we know from earlier testimony was a drug dealer, according to his ex-girlfriend. And so this ended up feeling like a witness who ended up backfiring, and the emotion of the family certainly reflected that, where they had been previously some handshakes, some hugs in a positive tone as they were leaving the courtroom during breaks in past days. Today it was a much more somber tone in the family.
You know, Mike, I want to pick up on something you said. How is it possible that the defense wouldn't have known about those text messages?
Well, there have been a significant amount of, especially in those pretrial hearings, debates and discussions about what evidence could be introduced. We saw Abby Lowell wanting to introduce some text messages that were relevant during the testimony from Hallie Biden the day before that the judge had ruled out. And the tactics he used to try to get them introduced into evidence were very tortured. And so Abbe Lowell had said as well during some of these pretrial hearings that he did not have enough time to prepare for this trial. He asked for an extension in the timeline. And so that kind of lack of preparation perhaps revealed itself today during that moment.
And so, Mike, what are some of the considerations going into whether Hunter himself will take the stand next week? That could be huge.
Well, given the direction that this week has gone, and it feels like it's gone in a very bad direction for Hunter Biden, the question is what testimony could he offer to both maybe bring the jury into his mindset to speak to whether he was in fact clean, at least in his own view, when he purchased that gun and checked that he was not an addict on that form? Is there any better way to maybe humanize him, to create some sympathy for him in the jury? Or could it, under prosecutorial cross-examination, backfire yet again? We understand that Hunter Biden has done some extensive mock testimony with his team, as much as 20 hours in the previous weeks. He certainly seems like he thinks he could do himself some good, but the way in which the defense counsel seemed to abruptly change their strategy after Naomi's testimony today, canceling plans for James Biden, his uncle, to testify, it seems like this is a very crucial set of decisions that the family will have to make over the weekend about whether this serves his case.
Mike Memoli, live for us in Delaware. Mike, thank you. And up next, new NBC News reporting on the guy the Republican Party just hired to help craft the party's platform, his deep connections to the election-denying Stop the Steal movement, and what it means for the Republican Party. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Just over a month out from the Republican National Convention, the RNC is tapping a prominent supporter of the Stop the Steal movement to help craft its party platform. My NBC News colleagues Sahil Kapoor and Ryan Riley report that Ed Martin, former chair of the Missouri Republican Party who was in D.C. on January 6th, was selected to serve as deputy policy director for the Republican Platform Committee, which drafts the policies the party will run on in November. And joining me now is one of the authors behind this piece, NBC News' Sahil Kapoor. And Sahil, I want to talk to you about your reporting. Just break it down for us. Who is Ed Martin, and why did the RNC bring him in?
Hey, Gabe. Well, Ed Martin is a social conservative activist. He's a protege of the late Phyllis Schlafly. He's outspoken on some common conservative causes, such as opposing legal abortion, such as opposing same-sex marriage. He opposes no-fault divorce. What caught our eye here is how prominent a figure he was in that so-called Stop the Steal movement leading up to January 6, 2021. He was hired just a few weeks ago by the RNC to be the deputy policy director on the platform committee who will write the platform that the party runs on in 2024. And what we found is that he was outspoken in denying the result of the 2020 election. He claimed Donald Trump won when Trump actually lost. He spoke at a Stop the Steal rally on the eve of January 6th, and he attended Trump's famous speech on January 6th. On the day of January 6th, he marched to the Capitol with that mob of Trump supporters, and he tweeted #StopTheSteal. He tweeted #DoNotCertify, in other words, saying that Congress should overturn the result of that election. And as the violence was happening, he downplayed it. He compared it to Mardi Gras. Later, he could claim that the optics of January 6th were staged, that the violence didn't actually happen, promoting several conspiracy theories that have persisted. Now, Martin has not walked back those comments at any point. He did not respond to our requests for comment, but after our story was published, he tweeted it, and let's show his tweet. Martin tweeted it with the caption, quote, "Thank you for noticing my work." That sounds like he believes that it's either not relevant to his being hired by the RNC, or it's a net positive, that election denial in this era of Donald Trump as he marches to a third successive nomination is a net positive for him within the party now.
It's pretty remarkable. Maybe he likes the attention, obviously. So, Sahil, is this a trend inside the RNC? How many election deniers are there in positions of power right now?
Oh, it absolutely is. I mean, you start with the man right at the top, Donald Trump, the former president. He's about to be nominated again. He has exerted tighter control of the RNC, appointing as his handpicked chair a man named Michael Whatley, who has refused to commit to, accepting the 2024 election result if Donald Trump loses. Trump has appointed as a chairperson his daughter-in-law, Lara Trump, who has claimed that there was massive fraud in the 2020 election, echoing his claims as well. And of course, some of Donald Trump's own vice presidential contenders, including senators like Marco Rubio, who voted to just certified Joe Biden's legitimate victory in the 2020 election, are now saying they won't commit to accepting the 2024 results. So this is not a story about one person. That's the key thing here, Gabe. This is a story about the institutionalization of this stop the steal philosophy at all levels of the Republican Party. You either embrace it or you go along with it, or you quietly avoid criticizing it, because if you do criticize it, and if you do criticize the man at the top, Donald Trump, you probably don't have much of a future in the Republican Party these days.
Saha Kapoor, thank you so much for that reporting. And turning now to more new reporting from our NBC Politics team, this time on the third-party presidential bid from left-wing activist Cornel West. My NBC News colleague Alex Seitz-Wald reports that West's campaign is essentially broke and is struggling to get on the ballot across the country. His campaign spent more on graphic design than ballot access efforts last month. And at the same time, Seitz-Wald reports operatives with Republican ties are trying to get West on the ballot in key states like North Carolina. Some Democrats are worried that it's part of a Republican effort to elevate West and pull votes away from President Biden. And joining me now is the aforementioned NBC News senior digital politics reporter, Alex Seitz-Wald. Alex, so empty the notebook for us. What is going on with Cornel West's ballot access campaign, and does his campaign actually know that these Republicans are trying to get him on the ballot?
Yeah, Gabe, this is something that there have been rumors about for a long time, and I've been chasing this story for about a month, but wasn't able to really nail down any hard evidence until I got an email earlier this week obtained through a FOIA request from a North Carolina elections official that showed the new party being formed by Cornel West allies to get him on the ballot in North Carolina authorized 3 people to pick up and drop off signatures on his behalf as part of the ballot access efforts. All 3 of those people work for a Republican consulting firm out of Colorado. Why are they in North Carolina helping Cornel West get on the ballot? They wouldn't tell me. They didn't respond to requests for comment. So that leaves the only plausible supposition, which is that they are trying to help Donald Trump and hurt Joe Biden by, quote unquote, taking votes away from Joe Biden. That's what another Republican operative said when he was spotted in April outside a Trump rally, also in North Carolina, registering people for Cornel West.
But does Cornel West's campaign know this is happening?
No, or at least they say they don't. They did not respond to comment for days, and then finally I got a response from them today saying that they had no idea these people were involved with a Republican firm, but they also did not disavow it. They said we have a wide range of supporters from across the ideological spectrum. The chairman of that new party in North Carolina that is trying to get him on the ballot said he knew these people only as volunteers, and he said that their names had been given to him by the National Cornel West campaign on a list of volunteers and marked with people who had experience with petition gathering. So, do they know? It's hard to really say, but it really looks like somebody, and we don't know who, is trying to help Cornel West get on the ballot, and his campaign doesn't seem to be looking too hard into rooting those people out.
Alex Seitz-Wald, thank you so much for that reporting. We appreciate it. And after the break, President Biden's personal apology to Ukrainian President Zelenskyy as he vows the U.S.'s unwavering support in its fight against Russia. The former ambassador to Ukraine joins us next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Stay with us.
I apologize for those weeks of not knowing what's going to happen in terms of funding, because we had trouble getting the bill that we had to pass that had the money in it from some of our very conservative members who were holding it up. But we got it done finally.
And welcome back. That was President Biden earlier today in Paris, offering a public apology to President Zelenskyy for the months-long delay in getting U.S. military assistance to Ukraine, during which Russian troops were able to make significant gains on the battlefield, particularly in northeast Ukraine. And during that bilateral meeting, President Biden also announced a new $225 million military aid package for Ukraine that includes much-needed artillery and ammunition. In response, President Zelenskyy thanked the U.S. for continuing to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. And joining me now is Bill Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and vice president for Europe and Russia at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. And what was your reaction to hearing President Biden publicly apologize on behalf of the U.S. for that delay in getting weapons to Ukraine?
So, Gabe, as you described, that 6-month delay was painful, costly. Soldiers died. Many soldiers died. They lost territory. So I was there 3 times during that 6 months during the delay, and each time I could feel the anxiety on the part of the Ukrainians rising. And in particular, again, as you said, the Russians took advantage. The Russians realized that the Americans were not providing the same kinds of weapons that they had been, and there was going to be some delay in the ammunition, and the Ukrainians couldn't defend themselves against the Russian attacks, in particular the drones and missiles. So the Russians took advantage of it, and it was very painful. So this was good that the president recognized exactly that problem.
You know, Ambassador, you just mentioned the anxiety of the Ukrainian people, but we've also been reporting about some of the friction between Kyiv and Washington over that pace of U.S. military assistance, as well as the tension with the current U.S. ambassador about her focus on anti-corruption reforms. What are you hearing on that front from the people in Ukraine? Is it not just anxiety, but is there real friction here?
Well, Gabe, there's always discussion, conversations. I wouldn't say friction. I would say, you know, there's emphasis. The emphasis clearly has to be on winning this war. They do have to win the peace, and that's the reform that needs to happen, and they need to do that now. But their first priority has to be, and frankly is, to win this war. So that is the discussion. Everybody understands. Everybody agrees with that. There's no disagreement on the U.S. side or on the Ukrainian side. On individual tactics, individual decisions, yeah, sure, there can be conversations. The Ukrainians know best how they're going to win this war, and they need our help. They definitely need our help. Once they have that, they can move forward, and I think you will see that movement has support from this administration and from the rest of NATO.
Ambassador, I want to talk to you about something that we're hearing will be a big topic of discussion next week at the G7 summit in Italy. Sources familiar with the planning tell me that one of the issues that will be talked about is this idea of funding Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, long term, essentially because they acknowledge that the political will here in the United States and really around the world has been dropping in that sense. So they're thinking of perhaps using the interest off of seized Russian assets and giving that to Ukraine, and perhaps in the form of some loan. Have you heard about that? What are your thoughts on that type of idea to help fund the war?
Absolutely. No, that makes perfect sense. Makes a whole lot of sense. At least take the interest from that $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves that are in Western banks. That $300 billion is frozen. And then the question is what to do with it, how to provide that to the Ukrainians. The first and likely first step is to do exactly what you said. Take the interest, make it the down payment on loans, the collateral for loans, and provide those loans to the Ukrainians. But they should really take the next step. Yes, my view would take the next step, that $300 billion. It's frozen. Seize it. Take it from those banks and provide it to the Ukrainians, both to fund the war, but also to fund the reconstruction. So yes, they should definitely do that.
And this has gotten some attention as well. Later this month, there will be a gathering of world leaders in Switzerland for a peace summit focusing on Ukraine. What do you make of the fact that President Biden is choosing to attend a campaign event over that summit? Is it a snub, like some of his critics are saying?
Gabe, it's not a snub. Vice President Harris is going to be there. Jake Sullivan is going to be there. Other members of his staff are going to be there. But you're right to point out this is an important event. This is an important summit. There will be many heads of state from the G7 nations, not the U.S., but other G7 nations sending their heads of state and others as well. Some 100 nations are going to be represented at this peace conference, not the Russians, because this is the first of 2 summits that the Ukrainians and the Swiss have in mind, which is start the process, start thinking now about what a just and lasting peace looks like, so that when eventually you get down to talking with the Russians, you'll know you've done some homework on, for example, what would just and lasting peace in terms of food security. In a just and lasting, there would be food security. The Ukrainians would be able to export their grain. Nuclear safety in a just and lasting peace, nuclear safety, both at power plants, but also on the use of on the non-use of nuclear weapons. The humanitarian part, Gabe, on returning soldiers, prisoners of war on both sides, and returning the children, the Ukrainian children that the Russians have taken from Ukraine, taken them back into Russia. Those kind of things ought to be discussed right now, even as they're getting ready for a second summit with the Russians at some future point.
So many issues to discuss as this war grinds on. Ambassador Bill Taylor, thank you so much for your expertise, as always. And turning now to the Biden administration's ongoing diplomatic efforts in the Middle East. The State Department announced today that Secretary Blinken will soon be making his 8th trip to the region since the October 7th Hamas attack, making stops in Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and Qatar. It comes as the administration and many Western partners continue to push Hamas to agree to the 3-phase ceasefire proposal currently on the table. But Secretary Blinken will also be heading back to the region as Israel finds itself facing even further diplomatic isolation. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres announced today that Israel has been added to the so-called blacklist of countries committing grave violations against children during an armed conflict. NBC News international correspondent Raf Sanchez has more from Tel Aviv.
Hey there. The Israeli government says it has been informed by the Secretary General of the United Nations that he plans to add Israel to a so-called blacklist of states that harm children during wartime. This is not a list that anyone wants to be on. It means Israel would be joining Russia, as well as non-state actors like Al-Qaeda, accused of harming kids during wartime. 8 months into the war in Gaza, thousands of children have been killed in the fighting. Israel says it takes all steps to minimize civilian casualties, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today slamming that decision by the United Nations, saying the UN put itself on the blacklist of history today when it joins the supporters of the Hamas murderers. The IDF is the most moral army in the world, and no delusional decision by the UN will change that. Now, this decision was a long time in the making, but by grim coincidence, it comes just one day after Israel bombed that UN school in central Gaza. Israel says it was targeting a number of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives who were sheltering inside of the school. But these schools have long been a refuge for Palestinian families seeking safety during this war, and hospital officials tell us at least 14 children were killed in the attack. Now, this is just adding to tension as it's confirmed that Prime Minister Netanyahu will be addressing a joint session of Congress towards the end of July. Some Democrats, including Senator Bernie Sanders, have said that they will boycott that address. Sanders calling the Israeli leader a war criminal, an allegation that Netanyahu, of course, denies. We are also learning that an American military temporary pier off the coast of Gaza will soon be operational once again. It went offline after being damaged in bad weather, which is a major blow to the humanitarian effort, especially at a time when the Rafah crossing, the main lifeline for food and aid from Egypt, remains closed. Back to you.
We want to thank Raf Sanchez for that reporting from Tel Aviv. And still to come, we're breaking down today's stronger than expected jobs report and whether it'll have any impact on voters' lackluster views of the economy. That reporting and the panel are next. You're watching Meet the Press now. And welcome back. If it's the first Friday of the month, it is Jobs Day, and the numbers from May show a surprising level of hiring. Employers added 272,000 jobs last month, well above forecasts of 190,000. The unemployment rate moved up ever so slightly to 4.0% from the previous month's 3.9%, as the Fed prepares to meet next week to discuss interest rates. This does not appear to be a jobs report that shows signs of an economic slowdown. And joining me now is CNBC economic editor Jeff Cox. And Jeff, this jobs report beat expectations. So what's your take?
Well, Gabe, I think there's a lot of good news here and a little bit of bad news. As you pointed out, the top line number is very good, 272,000, well above the Wall Street estimate, was just for 190,000 and over 100,000 more than what we saw back in April. And from what I had talked to economists beforehand, they thought that this number, the risk here was to the downside. So just another example of a robust U.S. Jobs climate, at least, and an economy that still continues to grow despite all of the kind of naysayers out there. A couple of words of caution here. You mentioned we saw that unemployment rate just kind of nudge a little higher to 4%. That's the highest it's been since January 2022. The household survey that unemployment rate is derived from also had some disturbing trends in it. Actually saw individual workers, over 400,000 people saying that they were out of work over the past month. Also continuing to skew towards part-time jobs instead of full-time jobs. So kind of complicated picture here, but overall, the labor market's still defying expectations and the economy is still continuing to grow.
So Jeff, what does this mean for the Fed? Is this report just too good for them to cut rates?
There's really nothing in this report today that would tell the Fed, hey, we need to cut rates here. And to the contrary, we saw pretty robust wage gains, 4.1% year over year. Fed officials will say that is not consistent with their 2% mandate. So when they meet this week, there's no chance whatsoever that they're going to be talking about cutting rates. I don't think they'll be talking about cutting rates even in July. I think maybe the earliest in September, but they're going to need to see some inflation numbers. That's the big thing right now. They're going to need to see those inflation numbers start to come in. And of course, we will get another important report about inflation next week on Wednesday. The Labor Department releases its Consumer Price Index report.
Jeff Cox with CNBC. Thank you so much for bringing us your expertise. And joining me now here on set is Julia Manchester, national politics reporter for The Hill. Simone Sanders Townsend, former senior advisor to Vice President Harris and co-host of The Weekend on MSNBC, and Stephen Hayes, editor and CEO of The Dispatch, also an NBC News political analyst. Thank you all so much for joining me. Julie, I want to start with you. Look, we're talking about how great the economy appears to be, and yet 46% of Americans rate the economy as poor in a new Gallup survey. Does this make the White House just want to tear its hair out?
Yeah, it's a real conundrum for the Biden campaign and for the White House right now, because there is no doubt this is progress. This is good economic news, and we'll continue to see them, tout that. The problem is Americans still aren't feeling that. When Americans go to the grocery store, they're still seeing prices that are higher than what they're used to, and Republicans are certainly seizing on that. So we're saying, look, we're still seeing inflation. So it's a conundrum for them, and it's sort of a messaging issue for them.
So, Simone, they're calling this a vibe session. What do you make of that?
I think the millennials have made their way into the messaging room.
So, yeah, the disconnect, that vibe session, I'm told, is the difference between what the economy actually is and, what people think it is. How does the Biden campaign finally cut through? We've been talking about this for months. How are they going to cut through? They still haven't cut through. 5 months of the election, what happened?
I think that there's two things. Just like people say that there are like two Americas, there are also two economies, right? It is the sheer numbers. GDP is up, right? These jobs report is by all means a good jobs report. This is a trend for the Biden-Harris administration. So that is true. That is one America. The other America is an America where people are still working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, and just in order to put food on the table to feed their families. Housing is one of the number one issues when you talk to, as I like to say, real, regular people across the country, whether they're white, black, Latino, Asian American, Pacific Islander, or otherwise. Housing, renting costs. The rent is literally too damn high. It is insane. If you want to buy a house, interest rates are upwards of 7%. Even very, very rich people are like, I'm about to rent. So that is the reality that people are dealing with, in addition to the grocery store. But some prices at the grocery store are going down, and you had companies like Target, for example, announce they'll be slashing prices on household items that people buy all the time. That, to me, says that it's also the corporations, and it's not just the politicians of the policy.
So it can be a mixed bag. But, Stephen, in an alternate universe, a Republican candidate looking at this would be laser focused on the economy. And Donald Trump is not laser focused on the economy. Should he be more focused on the economy and kind of let this other stuff that he's talking about fall by the wayside?
I mean, yeah, of course, right? I mean, look, the things that he does, the grievance politics that Donald Trump has mastered is helpful to him in that it galvanizes his base. They're excited about it. They want to hear more about it. They think he's a victim. They think they're victims too. So to that end, he's probably smart to do that. But does it help him reach the kind of people who I think are likely to decide the election in the middle, the kind of people who are still worried about these grocery prices? I mean, I think that Simone's right that some of these prices are coming down. The problem is, if you compare where they are today to where they are 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, they're still way up. And the challenge, I think, for the Biden administration, the reason they're having so much difficulty making their case is people are reminded of this every week. You go to the grocery store and you get I mean, this is true of me. I get a pound of ground beef and I think,
it's like, do I need
so
this whole pound or do I need half a pound?
Yeah. And I keep getting, I keep getting the whole pound. But, you know.
You really struck a chord there. It's something that Americans have to deal with every single week. Contrast that, Julia, to what the president was talking about today, a threat to democracy. He's been, hitting that message over and over again. Now he's doing it on the world stage. It wasn't an overtly political speech today, but it's a message that dovetails with his campaign. Do you think that will be effective given what Stephen is talking about, that something like the economy is something that Americans have to deal with week in, week out? Do they deal with the threat to democracy in their daily lives?
I think they do, and there's certainly the argument it's a bit more abstract than the economy. The economy is something we feel. A threat to the democracy, it's a little more abstract. But I think also what Joe Biden did today is trying to draw a contrast with Donald Trump, because while Donald Trump is continuing to rail against this guilty verdict and talking about appealing and such and holding these rallies, doing a lot of grievance politics, Joe Biden is out with the big world players in Normandy, celebrating, the courage of Americans, 80 years ago, creating that contrast. And I think it's also notable that he went to the place where Ronald Reagan once made a speech in Normandy, kind of in a way saying, look how far the Republican Party has changed.
And Simone, I was talking about this with Vaughn earlier in the program, though. Republicans they're co-opting that message, aren't they? They are talking about threats to democracy, but the way they see it is they claim the Democrats and Joe Biden are weaponizing the justice system as they see it, with no evidence. But they do say that it is Democrats that are a bigger threat to democracy. What do you make of that message?
I think they're trying to gaslight the American people in some respects, because it's kind of hard if I'm a regular voter to believe that when I literally see the president's son on trial. And he could do so. He could step in and write a pardon. He said proactively that he's not going to do that. And so it's kind of hard for folks to believe, is he weaponizing the Justice Department if his own son is sitting there amidst a trial? I do think that threats to democracy are real for folks when it comes to things like their freedoms. We talk a lot about the effect abortion is going to have on this election, and sometimes it doesn't show up in the data, but I do think this idea that you and your doctor are not the only ones making a decision for your lives, and some elected official you don't even know sitting in the state capitol somewhere wants to tell you what to do, is something that people are really concerned about. And they are faced with that every single day when women are literally being told they have to bleed out or be near death before they can get the health care that they need. That's happening in communities across America.
And Stephen, what do you think about the Republicans hitting this threat to democracy message in a completely different way than Democrats?
Yeah, look, I think there were legitimate complaints about what happened in New York. I think there are legitimate complaints about the way that the case was brought, the theory of it, and the way it was executed. But what Republicans are doing is conflating that with all of Donald Trump's other problems, legal problems, which I think most of which he brought on himself. I think the evidence is very strong in these other three cases. And I think Republicans have decided to use this as sort of a tool to galvanize that base, to portray Donald Trump as the victim. And he likes it. He's riding it.
And before we go, I want to bring up some other news that broke a little earlier today regarding Clarence Thomas. For the first time, he acknowledged on his financial disclosure report those two 2019 trips that he took with a Republican donor, one of them very controversial, to Bali. He finally acknowledged, is this going to add more fuel to the fire on Supreme Court ethics, Billy?
You know, I think it very well could, and it comes at a time when Samuel Alito is already under a lot of pressure, you know, about the flag situation and such. So absolutely. And remember, this was all brought to light due to a ProPublica report a couple of years ago. So absolutely, it keeps it in the conversation.
Simone, you know what we also found out from those disclosure reports? Ketanji Brown Jackson.
She went to see Beyonce. Beyonce gave her tickets.
$3,700.
I mean, that means she had good seats, if you ask me. And shout out to Beyonce and Jay-Z. I just look on the Supreme Court, Democrats, I just think they need to play a little bit more hardball. This so formal, this Supreme Court. Some justices are literally thumbing their nose at the three branches of power, the structure, tradition, ethics in and of itself. And I just think Democrats, they have the power. They should do something about it. What that something is, I'll be waiting with bated breath.
Simone Sanders Townsend, Stephen Hayes, and Julia Manchester. Thank you all so much for joining me here on the panel. And thank you all at home. We're back Monday with more Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez. The news continues with Aaron Gilchrist in for Hallie Jackson. Right.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.